Apart from the fact that it is dedicated to two deities instead of one, the architecture of the temple is classical as soon as you enter one of the two entrance doors. A colonnaded courtyard, two hypostyle rooms, and three antechambers to cross before arriving at the sanctuaries, which are surrounded by small chapels. We'll see what's left of it today. Let's start with the monumental gate built under Ptolemy XII. It is he whom we see represented on this door, making offerings to the gods. As you can see, the upper part and the lower part are very degraded. I will therefore only speak of the scenes that are still clearly visible. Let's look at the decoration in the middle first. There are several rows of baskets bearing the cross of life surrounded by two was scepters. On the other lines we see a variety of different basket motifs. Some carry the god's name Ha, Master of Eternity, and the others bear the king's name in their cartouche, protected by the cobra goddess Wadjet. The best preserved scene on the right is where the king offers bouquets to Geb and Nut, the national form of Sobek and Hathor. Below, he offers a fumigation of incense and a libation to Isis and Osiris, flanking their son Horus. On the left, we see the king offering an ointment container in the shape of a sphinx to Ptah and Sekhmet. If Ptah is not represented in his usual mummified form, it's because he is associated here with Tatanen, the oldest earth god of Memphis. Below, the god Min, accompanied by Isis, receives from the king a pectoral which he already wears around his neck. Because in Egyptian iconography, the action and the result of the action are very often represented together. Here, the king makes an offering of the Ujat eye to Shu and Tefnut, the national form of Horus and Tas-Net Nefret. We will see later the importance given to the eye in the temple of KOM OMBO. The south face is also decorated with scenes of offerings. In this scene, the king offers sacrificed animals to Sobek and Hathor, while presenting them with the Sekhem scepter, a symbol of power and force. Below, he offers Hawaris and Paneptawi a tray of food. Between the door and the temple, the chapel of Hathor is well preserved. It would have been built under the Emperor Domitian in honor of Aphrodite. It is not open to the public. Coffins and a statue are placed right next to it, but I cannot tell you more about them. Before entering the courtyard, I suggest we stop in front of the remains of the stone enclosure dating from the same period. Only the southwestern part has well-preserved scenes. The Sobek, Hathor and Khonsu triad hosts a parade led by Emperor Domitian wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. Before the gods, the long text is the hymn to Sobek. Quite important for the theology of KOM OMBO, it notably presents the genealogy of the crocodile god. And here is the parade of gifts offered to the triad by Nile gods, goddesses and geniuses of Upper Egypt. At the top are the remains of two scenes. On the right, the king, followed by his Ka, is accompanied by a Sem priest. He advances, preceded by standards. On the left, the king was carried in a sedan chair by the 3 souls of Pi, which are no longer visible, and the 3 souls of Nekhem. A little reminder, what we call soul, the Egyptians called it Ba. And here we are in the hypostyle courtyard, which precedes the pronaos. None of the 16 columns are intact, but they are all standing. They date from the time of Tiberius, and it is he who will be seen making the offerings to the gods. Some details are particularly neat and detailed, and we are pleasantly surprised by their state of conservation. The columns located to the south of the temple are the best preserved. Turning to the first hypostyle hall, we immediately notice that the central column forms a perfect axis of symmetry between the southern part and the northern part of its facade. The scenes depicted are identical. On the north side, King Ptolemy XII is arriving at the temple preceded by standards. In front of him, the priest Iunumutef incenses him. The standards are held by the signs Ankt and Was, which have been provided with arms. It's exactly the same scene that we saw on the Domitian wall. Although it has been hammered out, it can also be seen at the end of the facade on the south side, made with the same attention to detail. Admire the delicacy of his feet, shod in sandals, which indicates that the king is still in the human world. The panel next to this scene contains, to the north and to the south, a door framed with texts. Above the doors we find, as is customary, the Horus of Bedet. The next panel shows a purification scene. On the north side, Ptolemy XII is purified by Tot and Horus in the presence of Haoris, of whom only the legs are visible. Above, the cartridges have kept their colours. On the south side, he is purified by the same gods, but this time in the presence of Sobek, which is quite logical. Below the 2 Horus of Bedet, there is a text dedicated to Ptolemy XII and for the gods Haoris and Sobek. The doorway has exactly the same decoration as the central part of the monumental door. Only the lower cartouches are engraved with the name of Ptolemy XII, the others are empty. On the back of the facade, on the south side, the goddesses Wedjet and Nekbet crowned Ptolemy XII in the presence of Sobek Re and Hathor. The scene is depicted in a conventional way, except that the transparency of the clothes gives the impression that the figures are naked. On the north side, a beautiful scene involves 4 protective gods around Ptolemy XII. Horus and Tot lay their hands on the king's crown. Nut and the lion-headed Isis have placed a reassuring hand on his shoulders. With her left hand, Isis breathes eternal life into him. This representation of Isis is quite exceptional. The Ptolemies made multiple variations of pharaonic gods, and nothing should come as a surprise. Here they wanted to symbolize the protective aspect of Isis, which is a maternal breath which can be aggressive, as is Sekhmet, to defend the sovereign. Above the north door, Ptolemy XII presents offerings to 3 gods seated on thrones. Although we are at the entrance to the part dedicated to Haoris, Sobek Re is seated behind him. The consort of Haoris, Tas-Net Nefret, is only in 3rd position. To complete the north wall, here is what remains of a royal ascent scene. As is customary in temples of this period, the bell-shaped columns are all different. The ceiling and the lintels were also richly decorated, mainly with astronomical scenes. The king, appearing in all the scenes on the walls, is the grandfather of Ptolemy XII, Ptolemy VIII. In the next room we will also see Ptolemy VI, who began the construction of the temple. These two kings were the main builders, as you can see in this image. During the visit to the two hypostyle rooms, I will not comment on the scenes of offerings, which are not particularly original, but will tell you the story of these two Ptolemies, which is far more. Ptolemy VIII has a brother, Ptolemy VI, and a sister, Cleopatra II. In 172 BC, Ptolemy VI married Cleopatra II. Marriages between brother and sister were the custom among the Lagid. From 170 to 163 BC, the two brothers reigned jointly over Egypt, but did not get along. In 163 BC, Ptolemy VIII became king of Cyrenaica, which is part of the present-day Libya, leaving the throne of Egypt to his brother Ptolemy VI. In 145 BC, Ptolemy VI is seriously wounded in a combat and dies the same year. His son was only 15, so Cleopatra II became regent. A year later, she married her second brother, Ptolemy VIII, who again became king of Egypt. Upon his accession, he had his nephew assassinated and expelled the scholars from the Museum of Alexandria. These gestures will earn him the image of a cruel and unscrupulous monarch and announces the fight between himself and his sister wife. But they will still have a son, Ptolemy Memphite. 2 years later, Ptolemy VIII married his niece Cleopatra III, the daughter of Cleopatra II, without repudiating his first wife. They are seen here together with the same name. Only the text written above differentiates them. This curious threesome ruled Egypt for 12 years. Then Cleopatra II manages to drive out her daughter and brother, who takes revenge by having his own son, Ptolemy Memphite, murdered. It's even rumoured that he sent the dismembered parts to his mother. In 129 BC, Ptolemy VIII manages to reconquer Alexandria as well as part of the country. He takes back his throne and Cleopatra II goes into exile for 5 years in Syria, carrying the royal treasure with her. Then she returns to Alexandria and reconciles with her brother and daughter. In 118 BC, several decrees taken jointly by Ptolemy VIII and his two wives confirm it. The least we can say is that the Ptolemies are not spiteful. The second hypostyle hall communicates with the first antechamber by 2 doors. The more we advance towards the sanctuaries, the more we go back in time. This part dates from the reign of Ptolemy VI. It is therefore he who is represented in the scenes. It's destroyed now, but the rite of tending the line in order to determine the north-south axis of the temple was shown, surveyed by the goddess Seshat. She combined the functions of goddess of writing, astronomy, astrology, architecture and mathematics. Behind her, Haoris promises the king that Seshat will give him millions of said feasts. If she is often represented wearing a leopard skin dress, it is because the spots on her fur symbolize the stars. The following scene is also part of the founding rite of the temple. Facing Haoris, Ptolemy VI purifies the temple depicted in the middle by throwing natron pellets. Natron is a mixture of sodium salts from lakes in desert-like regions, widely used in antiquity. The word natron is the origin of the chemical symbol for sodium. On the opposite wall is the ceremony of the beginning of the construction of the temple. Ptolemy VI pours a bucket of sand in front of Haoris and Tas-Net. The sand will support the foundation of the building, and by the magnitude of its grain will ensure the longevity, even the eternity of the temple. Ptolemy VI plays the sistrum for Hathor. The king offers the signs Ankt, Jed and Was to Osiris-Unen-Nefer, followed by Isis and Nephthys. He offers a breastplate to Haoris and Tas-Net. Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II, bearers of offerings and flowers, lead a procession of countryside goddesses and Nile gods. The bull god, Apis, whose head is destroyed, prepares offerings in front of Haoris and Tas-Net. It is he who will offer them to the gods on behalf of the king who stands behind him. In exchange, the gods will offer the king the 2 crowns and universal sovereignty. A scene that is often repeated in the temple is the king and queen walking in front of the parade of the gods of the Nile. The right jamb of the door shows scenes of offerings to the triad of Haoris. The left jamb to the triad of Sobek. Here the king offers milk to Panaptaui, who plays the role of Khonsu. The lintel is almost completely destroyed. In both scenes, the position of the king and the gods is identical. Sobek is on the right, Haoris on the left. On the left, the king is turned towards the sanctuary of the falcon god, on the right towards the sanctuary of the crocodile god. Below, we find a scene of offerings that we have seen already, in which the bull god acts as intermediary between the king and Sobek and Hathor. When I say the king, it is of course Ptolemy VI, and if he is followed by a woman, it is his wife's sister Cleopatra II. You will recognize in the gods receiving the offerings the triad of Sobek or the triad of Haoris. I realise that I have not yet really presented the 2 masters of the place. Haoris and Sobek are allies in the fight against the enemies of the divine order. In the sky, the combat is carried out by Haoris and on the ground by Sobek. Apart from the fact that he is also considered the creator of the terrestrial world and the god of waters and fertility, I don't have much to tell you about Sobek. For Haoris, I found two slightly different versions of the myth. First version. Originally, Haoris is a mummy without eyes, an empty face. Eyes are given to him, by whom I don't know, so that now he can see at night and even light up the darkness. He becomes an ophthalmologist god, a good doctor in truth, as the texts of KOM OMBO say. Hence the representation of surgical instruments engraved on the wall of the outdoor ambulatory. Second version. His eyes are the sun and the moon. When neither is visible, Haoris is blind. This blindness does not, however, prevent him from fighting. As he does not see his adversaries, he kills both enemies and friendly deities who support the world, which jeopardizes the balance of the universe. So, it is to cure the god of his handicap that the priests of KOM OMBO had the surgical instruments engraved in the ambulatory meant to treat him. We'll see them a little later in the video. We have arrived at the most sacred place of the temple, the shrines of the two deities of KOM OMBO. All that is visible are the remains of the two naos on which was placed the statue of the god that the priests venerated 3 times a day. All around the sanctuaries there was a passage called the mysterious corridor on which opened a series of small chapels. There isn't much left. The temple was surrounded by different enclosures, built by different rulers. The Greeks, Ptolemy VIII and Ptolemy XII, and the Roman emperors, Domitian and Trajan. The surrounding walls completely disappeared on the north side. What remains of the ambulatory is located to the east and south, between the enclosures of Domitian and that decorated by Trajan. I will show you the most remarkable scenes. This scene seems to be the most recently engraved on the wall. Here, the Emperor Commodus offers a curious object to Tefnut and Tas-Net. The god Tot, who took the form of a baboon, protects a chest in which there are magic scrolls. The Emperor offers 2 wedjet eyes to Haoris, probably so that he never loses his sight. The Emperor presents a vase containing the menu drink, made from beer and reserved for the goddesses during the solemn festivals of Hathor. The rest of the decor is more degraded, but we still recognize the gods and goddesses of the triads of Sobek and Haoris. Now we arrive in front of the most famous relief of the temple, that of the surgical instruments. It represents a festival that took place every year in the temple of KOM OMBO, the repairing of the eye of Horus torn out by the god Set, his uncle and enemy. In front of the ceremony, Isis and Nephthys are seated on the temple to protect it. Behind them is an altar on which are depicted surgical tools that allowed the eye of Horus to be ritually reconstructed. The eye is then plunged into a basin containing water from the flooded Nile. It is thanks to this ritual that Horus, Haoris for the Greeks, regained his physical integrity and his power. From this point, this reconstructed eye, which is called the Ujat eye, became the symbol of those that are physically affected but healed and resuscitated. Opposite the representation of medical instruments, a large scene is engraved in high relief, i.e. the stone is cut out instead of being hollowed out. This is called cultural relief. In 3 registers, it presents a summary of the entire KOM OMBO theology. It was placed on the outer wall for ordinary believers who were not allowed to enter the temple. In the centre of the relief are 6 columns of text, the double hymn. The left part concerns Sobek and the right part Haoris. On each side, Haoris and Sobek look inside the temple. At their feet we see their respective weapons, the sword of victory for Sobek and the human sword or lit, the one that comes for Haoris, and both have a Wadjet eye. Below the double hymn, 2 mirrored scenes represent 3 chained prisoners, presents of animals, papyri and lotuses. Higher up, a small naos contained a statue of the goddess Maat, carved in stone and represented from the front. The naos has eyes and ears to see the faithful and hear their complaints. Above the central niche, the god of air, Shu, supports the sky surrounded by the 4 winds. The last scene I want to show you is this frieze that lists the defeated enemies of Egypt. The ovals are not cartouche, but the representation of conquered fortresses. The prisoners' faces were hammered out. Between 2 enemies was engraved the semitawi, the traditional representation of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Above the long frieze of enemies, a scene shows the king walking beside a lion whose teeth grip the hand of a prisoner. Our boat will leave in a few minutes, and we will end with a simple look at the north courtyard. Very little remains of the Sobek chapel and nothing of the crocodile pool. A well makes it possible to measure the height of the water of the Nile. And we see the remains of a Roman door. The Mamizi, probably built by Ptolemy VIII, included several rooms, but more than half of the temple collapsed into the Nile and only 3 sections of the wall remain. So this is the end of the visit. Thank you for accompanying me to the end. Join me for the next stop at Aswan.